I'm gonna introduce Jay officially here in a second, but for those of you that don't know me, I'm Timothy Kranz. I'm the painting and drawing professor here, the full-time painting and drawing professor here. And one of the reasons why I have this position is because of this man Ray. You can't have the job that I have without having an MFA, which is our field's equivalent of the closest field within our thing, for the most part, of doctorate, specifically in fine art, studio art, right? As I like to jokingly call it, it's like a master's on steroids, and really intense study. And the way that I did it, at least, we switched off and on with supervising professors, so every semester we'd have a different one. I took this man as much as I possibly could. He was the first person I met in the program. I was accepted in the program years before I actually ended up going there. I chickened out and ran away for a few years.
Right.
Yeah, chickened out and ran away for a few years and came back and said, "Will you guys have me back? And what do I got to do?" And they said, "Oh, we remember, come on back." So I gravitated towards him and Diane's day out, and both of them, really had huge impacts in my life. And like I say, if it wasn't for the education I got from Jay and the courage and everything that it caused, confidence that it gave me, I definitely wouldn't have the ability to get up in front of you guys and push you and push you and push you and push you. And I'm sorry for that. Anyway, he and his wife Patty both really mean a lot to me, and I always look forward to seeing you guys, and it's been great to have you both show me here now. And just on behalf of so many hundreds of Kimball students that you've impacted, man, thank you so much. And it's great having you together.
Thank you. That's nice.
I'm glad you made it.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming very, very much. I know most of you thought you'd be doing this a week ago, right? So that was the day that we had the delayed start and everything. And Jay, so one of the reasons I started talking to you early because Jay brought up something that I want you guys to realize. When you're committed to something, you got to do what you got to do. And Jay was just telling me, and in hindsight, you'll take this statement as Jay was just telling me, right, about the commute from Grand Rapids to Flint and how you never know what the weather on one side of the state is going to be to the other. Every time this man saw me when I was in grad school, I never moved to Grand Rapids. So every time he saw me, no matter how nasty it was outside or getting outside, right, while we're talking, and I'm soaking up and taking my time with everything he's saying and trying not to pay attention to the 8 inches of snow that have come down in a half hour, right? I had to make that drive. And a couple of people have said to me in the past, why didn't you move out there? Well, I had all these reasons at first, and honestly, my first winter wasn't bad. It was like a dream. It was like, the weather was always great. I would have felt stupid if I had, pulled over and stayed nice somewhere or whatever. That last year, though, made up for it, man. So many white knuckle drives on the way back, right? So, anyway. All right, so we'll get this started officially, and we want to give Jay some time to unwind.
I'm good.
You good? All right. So, welcome to the 5th in a series of talks by artists exhibiting in the Mott Visual Arts, or Mott Community College Fine Arts Gallery, Visual Arts and Design Center Gallery. The next exhibition in the gallery will feature the video work of Detroit area artist Cynthia Gregg. Cynthia will give a talk about her work on February 28th at 1 in room 129, which is that room right over there. and we hope you can attend. These events are made possible, as always, by the Ballinger Trust. Okay, so, all right, so just to introduce Jay himself a little bit more, as I said, he's, my professors from Kendall, but Jay, sorry, I gotta get all my notes here. Well, Jay Constantine is one of my professors from Kendall College of Art and Design. He's taught there for
39 years.
39 years? I thought it was 29. Wow, yeah.
Oh, it's a real shame to say that.
Yeah. I mean, that's amazing considering you're only 49 years old. But, anyway, I've talked enough. I'll let Jay go ahead and get started. So.
Okay. Alrighty, well, I always prefer to do more of a gallery talk than a slide talk, because I don't know, there's something about the lights going off and having slides go up that just kind of sometimes puts people to sleep, and I kind of like having the actual pieces to refer to. So if you don't mind, I'll occasionally sort of point to something, if I can, to illustrate, kind of what I've been doing for the past. Well, I started this series a little bit before 2015. It does represent probably about, the large tondos represent about 3 years of work. One of the tondos I no longer have. Luckily, it was bought by Grand Valley as a part of their collection in the Finkelstein building in Grand Rapids, which I was really glad to get, because these are kind of hellacious to store, and besides that, they do a better job of taking care of work than I do. So I'm glad that that's there, and I'm hoping more will follow, more acquisitions will follow. But anyway, I came to Grand Rapids probably in about 1980, and I was, in some ways, I think, sort of in my thinking, probably very much a product of the 60s and 70s, sort of open-ended ideas about religion, probably, an interest in Eastern religion, it's sort of a part of the thing I grew up with. Certainly, kind of questioning aspects of religion. So when I came to, from Ohio originally, hopefully you won't hold that against me, when I came to Grand Rapids, I have to admit I had a bit of I kind of went into a bit of a culture shock, because I had not in my many years run into Calvinism before. So that was a really different thing for me to run into. Also, there, as some of you may know, the west side of the state is very Dutch CRC, that is Christian Reformed Church. And again, I found myself being exposed to ideas in both Calvinism and some Lutheran ideas that bothered me a little bit. I had trouble with them. I also began to research some of the history of Christianity, and I guess my general feeling is that there was an awful lot of conflict in the early church, and conflict that really made me further question aspects of organized religion, and particularly Christianity. So anyway, I may say some things today that might offend you a little bit. I don't try to make a big deal out of it, but I was very interested in the history of conflicts in the church. And yes, coming from more of a perspective, I guess, a kind of an agnostic perspective, a critical perspective, kind of looking at the idea of, no, I'm not making religious paintings, but they are about religion. And in fact, sometimes people have even said that they thought they were religious paintings, which might indicate a failure on my part to get my point across. I don't know. But anyway, I did start with this particular piece here. And of course, the other thing that I haven't told you is that I am a history buff. I mean, I love history. I think if I had maybe chosen another area to focus on academically, it might have been history. And I think of these as sort of a revival of history painting. Now, history painting's been dead for a long time, but I really like the idea of reviving things, taking things that are supposedly dead and sort of re-examining them and then, you know, kind of reusing them and saying, hey, wait, I think I can make history painting relevant again. And I also think it's very important, this is not just my opinion, that your artwork be about what you're thinking about. You know, like now, about 10 years ago, I was really obsessed with science. And science got in my art. And I kind of think whatever it is you're researching and reading about and what you're interested in, that seems like, I guess my view is that that's the stuff that should be in your work. So naturally, I kind of worked with science and cosmology and kind of macrocosm, microcosm ideas, but then I started to get very interested in this subject because frankly I've been interested in it a long time, but thought there was no way to really make art about it. How do I make art about all these things that really bug me about Christianity? You know, how do you do that? And who do you end up offending? And can you ever sell a work of art that's like that? I don't know. But again, I decided that I sort of wanted to do a series dealing with that. So again, I think of these as kind of my own version of history painting. So in this particular one, again, I did a lot of research. I enjoy researching. It's essential to my creative process. I've got to have some stories. I've got to have information. I've got to have, you know, when I was doing my pieces on science, of course, I read every book available, you know, not just Stephen Hawking, but just everybody else who had written anything about the subject. And I find it gives me ideas, it enriches my work, but mostly it gives me ideas. So, you know, the idea of, you know, just sitting down and being creative, I suppose some people could do that, and I'm not saying it wouldn't be valid, but it's just not for me. I need to kind of read stuff and then use that for my work. So as I started doing research, I focused in on the area of heresy and heretics and who they were. You know, a lot of people think, of course, heretics and heresies are evil. Certainly the reason that they were so persecuted is because, of course, in many ways, heresy is right up there with blasphemy and apostasy, right? And apostasy means leaving the faith. Blasphemy means mocking or criticizing the faith. And of course, heresy is, hey, I have a different idea about the faith. And that got a lot of people in trouble. A lot of people who were admired in the church. For instance, figures such as Origen or Arius, as I have shown in that work. So I was very interested in the persecution and genocide of the Gnostic Christians, which this piece is about. Somewhere, I think, I get my dates wrong sometime, I believe this was 1209. And that's the other thing, I sort of, which some might exasperate some people, but I am very attracted to some of the obscure aspects of history, just because everybody doesn't know them anymore. And although, and I felt like, yeah, I want to re-explore that. I want to go and dig down in the archives and find out some of these things that have happened. So, in 1209, Pope Innocent III decided that he wanted to start a campaign against the Gnostic Christians living in southern France. So, who were these Gnostics? Well, you know, I think if you read any of Paul's letters, I think actually they come up. And of course he calls them false teachers, you know, that they had the wrong idea. Gnostics were interesting. They sort of pre-existed or predated Christianity. So they had their origin in early Hellenistic or Greek thinking. I actually read, well, I mean, I'm not trying to show off here or anything, but it just so happens I have read the Timaeus, or excerpts from the Timaeus by Plato, where he talks about a demiurge, a creator god. And this is Greek, you know, this isn't Christian. But anyway, I think that the Gnostics had a really different idea. You know, they had their own gospel. It's called the Gnostic Gospels, very esoteric stuff. That was not a patriarchal religion and had no power structure, unlike Catholicism. And let's face it, wealth and power might be sort of the Achilles heel of Catholicism at this time. They all worked. You had a group of renunciates at the very top called the so-called perfect ones, who basically, were ascetic. They resisted, all temptations and rejected the material world. And then there were a lot of other people who were just in southern France who were living a rural, quiet, pastoral, rural life with these interesting ideas. Another thing is that, and I look at this, if this religion had won out over Pauline Christianity, maybe it might have been a better world because they were more matriarchal. Women could have equal ability to, in this group of people. They didn't build cathedrals or acquire wealth. They lived super simple lives. And you know what? It was popular, and I think that was the problem. I think that the Catholic Church was losing momentum and losing their audience, and that means also their money. So they decided to persecute these Gnostic Christians. By the way, they believed in Docetism, which is the Gnostics thought that, Christians think that, Jesus was a man God, and the Gnostics tended to think he was just a God, And of course, then you have the other perspectives as well. So their idea was that Jesus was never a real man. He was kind of like always a spirit or something. But anyway, so the Pope initiates this campaign. He gets some rather brutal characters to carry it out and an army to march on France. I have Pope Innocent III represented here, which again, there aren't very good portraits of him, so I have to use an amalgam of different things. I used a combination of different portraits to come up with that. I think it might look close to what he looked like, but it almost doesn't matter, in a way. And I have Simon de Montfort there. I'm hoping I can remember all the names, because I do kind of forget stuff sometimes. One of the nobles that was promised lands, that if he would attack these various cities that were Cathar centers, and that's, the Gnostic Christians were called Cathars. And the name of his painting is the Cathar Massacre. So in other words, he was a sort of a religious fanatic, and also stood to gain lands if he attacked these people. Here I have Raymond IV. I'm sorry, I should check those. But he was very sympathetic to the Cathars, treated them as equals, and also Jews as well. Now, Pope Innocent III was one of the people who had decided to make the Jewish people wear badges to identify them. So he's sort of like some sort of early version of, Hitler or something, and discriminating against the Jewish people. So it's kind of a guy that you kind of, but anyway, he was very tolerant of the Cathars, and initially he defended them. But of course, after his lands were attacked and he was left with nothing, he realized that he had to abandon his support for the Cathars. We also have Arnaud Amalric, a famous monk. He was a Cistercian monk. And of course, he's the one that famously coined the phrase, kill them all, God will know his own. In other words, one of the problems is that the Cathars and the Catholics were very close to each other. They were neighbors. And so some of the Cathars would say, I'm Catholic, and some of the Catholics would defend them. And so the soldiers would go and say, I can't tell them apart, who am I supposed to kill here? And of course, that's where Arnaud Amalric made the famous quote, just kill them all, God will know his own. These people were pulled out of the cities and they were burned en masse. So we're not talking about just a couple burnings here. We're talking about, a total of maybe 20,000 people, and taken outside the city and burned at the stake, I have represented here some of the famous Cathar castles, which actually, if you ever look up, they even do tours of them now, of the mysterious Cathar castles, which are usually perched high up craggy mountains for protection. And of course, there are all kinds of stories about the Cathars, finally going to some of these refuges and, for kind of a last stand, I included the eclipses, the solar eclipses, to give the work a little bit of a cosmic feel, sort of like these events were sort of some almost cosmic consequence. And of course, all of these, so many of the images are appropriated. I used old prints and paintings to derive all the imagery, which of course I changed, a lot, but it's all appropriated. So the portraits, and what I have here is I used these little portraits of suffering people were taken from Signorelli's The Damned Cast into Hell. I also Michelangelo's Last Judgment, just because they seemed really appropriate. So anyway, really a real fun-loving painting there. But anyway, of course, my use of color is not really naturalistic. I mean, in some areas I think there's some naturalistic color, but a lot of the color is quite heightened, and I wanted to get a fairly kind of a look that would be a little bit disturbing, if not a little, what's the word I'm looking for, just something to really get one's attention. And so I've moved around. The second piece I did was of the Munster Revolt, again staying with the idea of various religious conflicts, and also kind of maybe a bit of a revisionist attitude. And by revisionist, I mean being sympathetic to the victims rather than regarding the heretics as bad people. This is such an interesting story, and again, I have to curb myself here a little bit, but you ought to look up the Munster Revolt sometime. It's really fascinating, because right around the time of, all of this kind of thing happened around the time of Luther's posting the 95 Thesis and the Reformation. I think the Reformation sometimes I see parallels sometimes between that and the age of the 60s, because it sort of suddenly gave people not the excuse, but the idea that they could have some kind of religious freedom or economic freedom that they hadn't had before. So, and of course, I think, I might be wrong on this, I thought the last time I checked, I think the posting the 95 Thesis was like 1517, I think. And then of course you have the famous German peasant revolt. And again, that's so interesting because it's like suddenly these peasants say, we're not going to take it anymore. We deserve economic justice. And they revolt against the nobles. And of course the nobles slaughter them. And then this happens. The Munster Revolt happens not too long after the German peasant revolt. Now I did a piece about the German peasant revolt because I criticized, in this painting, I criticized Luther. Maybe I'll jump over here. Because, Luther is held in such high regard on the west side of the state, and of course throughout the United States because of his incredible, well, really for initiating the Reformation, but he wasn't all good. Sort of like what we find out about Columbus, It's like, Columbus was so great in this, and then we find out that, oh wow, Columbus enslaved people and did terrible things, We need to balance history out a little bit. So Luther, who in his later life, by the way, wrote a tract not only encouraging Christians to burn the homes, synagogues, and schools of the Jewish people, but even to attack them on the street if they saw them. Now again, this was in his later life, so maybe we should give him a break, But he also stood on the fence with the German peasant revolt. And there is that aspect of Christianity where it sometimes goes along with the status quo rather than standing up for justice. And yet at times it has stood up for justice.
we know we have liberation theology, it's a whole different thing. But at this particular time, he decided to stay out of it. Maybe he felt bad because in some ways the German peasant revolt might have been a little bit a result of his Reformation. But he didn't really want a real thoroughgoing revolution for the people. This was kind of for the clergy, and the princes that he represented, because let's face it, the princes, they were tired of paying taxes to the church, right? So what happens, his supporters are the nobles, and the nobles are the ones that are killing the peasants. So anyway, there are many people that feel it was a great failing on his part, that he didn't try to stand up for the peasants a little more. And he wrote some treatises. I mean, he did criticize the nobles for just wanton slaughter, but at the same time, he really condemned the peasants, who he really felt, really should just shut up and take it. They just didn't deserve a better life. They were meant for work. And that bothered me, and so I have him here, doing the hear no evil, see no evil, whatever thing with the German peasant revolt. And again, these are all appropriated images. This is these dancing peasants. One of them is an Albrecht Dürer print, and the other one, another Dutch artist or Northern European artist. And of course, I've got the dancing skeletons too with that. And of course, these are taken, images are taken from the German peasant revolt and engraving. And again, I'm kind of, appropriating, but you have to really transform them because it's hard to take old anonymous engravings and use them. And of course, but this of course is my own little still life here. I mean, I've kind of inserted my own little, with the map of Germany showing the areas where the German peasant revolt happened. So again, I'm sort of trying to, give some history and some criticism at the same time. But back again to the Munster Revolt, an interesting story because this is happening just a little bit after the German peasant revolt and the Reformation. So you've got this thing happening where you've got all of these, many of them unemployed, I guess they'd be like yeomen or something, taking a Jan of Leiden, kind of someone who had been apprenticed to a tailor and then was kind of basically wandering around Germany, sort of unemployed, and apparently there were an awful lot of people in that position economically. But anyway, Munster gets identified as a place where people are talking in kind of Lutheran terms. I should mention that the people of the Munster Revolt were the Anabaptists, and they were considered heretical for stuff that really seems not that big of a deal now. They didn't believe in childhood baptism. They only believed in adult baptism, and I think the idea behind it was that, baptizing a baby who doesn't have the ability to speak for itself was sort of invalid, that only an adult could make that decision. And if you notice anything that sounds familiar to the Amish, you're right, because the Amish and the Mennonites and the Hutterites are what's left of the Anabaptists in America. They were pretty much, the Anabaptists were like wiped out. And what got me about it is that they were victims of both Catholic and Protestant violence. The mainstream Protestants persecuted them and put them to death. But they were also, here's the cycle of it. You have the Catholics who call the mainstream Protestants, like Luther and Zwingli and such, they're calling them heretics. But then the Protestants are calling the Anabaptists heretics, and it's like some terrible cycle, And I've wondered at times, it always seemed religions go through this. Remember, Christianity starts, yes, the Jews persecute the Christians, but then the Christians go in cahoots with the Roman Empire, and suddenly they're persecuting the Jews and also persecuting other Christians as being heretics. So it's like this cycle, this terrible cycle that goes on. And I realize that as I'm talking here, probably some of you are really cringing and want to kill me or something. But anyway, I mean, hey, I'm just being honest with you, and you can give me your opinions later. But anyway, what happened is some of these people concentrated themselves in the city of Munster, and they said, okay, we're going to concentrate ourselves here. They took over the fortified city. Anybody who didn't go along with their Anabaptist ideas, they sort of chased out of the city. And the city was put under siege for about a year by this character right here, Franz von Waldeck, who was the Prince Bishop of Munster. I think he secretly was hoping that the Lutheran Revolution would succeed because he had 8 kids and a common law wife. I don't think that was probably that unusual then, and they often say that the whole celibacy thing didn't really happen in the Catholic Church until the 11th century. And who knows, maybe certain parts of the Bible where they talk about chastity and celibacy, maybe interpolations, things that were added later. Again, I know that kind of freaks people out, but of course it is true that there were things inserted in the Bible later to justify a lot of things. So anyway, they take over the city of Munster. Franz von Waldeck gets his Catholic friends to surround the city. They wait for a year, and all kinds of mayhem happens. Now, Jan of Leiden, again, I find myself sympathizing with these characters. He's like just a regular guy, but charismatic. They didn't have a lot of, they did have some clergy, but mostly this seems to be like a real middle-class thing. It wasn't people who were knowledgeable about the Bible, but not clerics, sort of regular people. And so you get Jan of Leiden, who's, okay, he's a bit of I guess you can relate to him. He was a bit of an opportunist. He makes himself king of Munster. And he makes polygamy legal. And he had 8 wives. And I understand he also, since the city was starving, he also ate a lot better than most of the regular people. And so you often see the famous print of Jan of Leiden when he was jailed. This is taken from when he was jailed. And of course, his story of his torture is unbelievable. He and many of the other, von Waldeck and his troops, they broke through the city. The character I have on the left, who's supposed to be a young man, again, there's no portraits of these people, so I had to kind of invent things with them. But he, the name's escaping me right now, but Grisbeck, I think. But anyway, a young man who let the soldiers in the city, couldn't take it anymore. And he was a young man and kind of maybe not fully mature, and just felt that the situation was getting too desperate inside the city where people were starving. But of course they take Jan of Leiden and Bernard Nipperdalling, I think is his name, at the bottom. And of course they are publicly tortured. And I have scenes from there was a sketch of, they had hot, what are they, not calipers, but tongs, yeah. They were kind of heated up, and then their muscles and flesh were ripped on a man. The idea was that had to go on for at least an hour, and then as they say, their quivering bodies were thrown into cages, and the cages were hoisted up on the city cathedral. So, pretty horrible death. I have a overhead view of the city of Munster that I used an old map to sort of do my own sort of version of it. And again, all of the scenes of torture and combat were taken from etchings and engravings depicting the scenes. Again, sounds very similar to the German peasant revolt in a way. And then I have other characters who are in that. I have a portrait of Ulrich Zwingli, who was sort of the Martin Luther of Switzerland, who had condemned the Anabaptists. And then I have some other characters in there as well. So anyway, trying to tell a story, trying to use a circular format similar to rose windows and mandalas, and some have said, well, hey, what's the deal here, Jay? You're using these rather spiritual forms, kind of a spiritual format, and yet you're putting all these terrible events in them. And I don't know if this is successful or not, but I sort of thought, is it possible that I could subvert the format and use it? In other words, take a religious format, but put this kind of horrific stuff in there, or at least this highly troubling stuff. How bad would that be? I mean, it is spiritual. This is about our spiritual history. Why shouldn't I use the format of a rose window of a cathedral? I don't know. You'll have to decide whether it's successful or not. I finally have over here, and again, I don't. How far am I into this? Is it a half hour in or longer? I don't know.
45 minutes.
What's that?
45.
45 minutes. Okay, I won't make it too much longer. I don't want to test your ability to stay awake. That wouldn't be your fault. That would be my fault. But anyway, I have here the poisoning of Arius. And this is a kind of an interesting scene. Now, I was very bothered. But, again, in my research, I kind of wanted to dig back. What happened? How did Christianity become what it is? And, of course, you have to go back to the Nicene Council. And I was very curious, so I explored this subject. Now, Arius, I don't think he was an outsider. I think he had a huge audience who were, I think it's only later they were called Arians. But these people believed that Jesus was not God himself, but sort of a lesser divinity. Like an angel or, something like that. And he had biblical backup. I believe from the Gospel of John, where at one point Jesus says, I think that when he goes to heaven, he'll go to one greater than himself. So they had some passages that indicated that, maybe, God was subordinate. Jesus was subordinate to God. So anyway, Arius was one of those people. But of course, at the First Nicene Council, that was the big hot button issue. Because of course, the Nicene Christians wanted Jesus to be co-equal to God. In other words, he was God, right? So anyway, it was a terrible, I won't say terrible, but it was a terribly contentious meeting. One where the St. Nicholas, not Santa Claus, but the St. Nicholas actually assaulted Arius during the proceedings. It was really intense. A lot of people on both sides, although the majority was with the Nicene Christians. Anyway, I kind of wanted to create this tribute to him. Why? Because, here's how the story goes. After this first meeting of the Nicene Council, Arius's works are burned and he's exiled. And then the emperor, who wants to, my namesake, I hate to bring it up because it sounds like I'm having some ego thing over it, but I think we need to remember that Constantine the Great murdered his wife and son. This guy was no walk in the park. And he only used Christianity because he thought it would revitalize his empire. I don't think he gave. And people say that he really wasn't even baptized until his deathbed. So he was really still pagan. He believed in the sun god, So anyway, just to disrespect him a little bit. But anyway, he invites Arius back and says, I'm going to let you back into the church if you recant your views. And he did recant. But the Nicene Christians, and I don't think they were a very nice bunch. In fact, Constantine, I think, actually realized he had made a mistake with siding with him. By the way, he was baptized by an Arian bishop, which is interesting. I think he felt that this Nicene crowd were troublemakers, that everything was a freaking problem with these guys. Anyway, it's interesting. He invites Arius back to the church, and Arius is getting ready to take communion. And then suddenly his gut sort of split open and, it's a big mess. I mean, he's like, he just explodes. He was poisoned. And the only one, let's face it, the only ones that would have had a motive would have been the Nicene Christians. And to me, it seemed to be the earliest example of violence against those who thought differently. I felt that there should have been a tribute to him. A lot of people know the story, but anyway, before he ever gets to enjoy coming back into the church, he's so mistrusted and vilified that he's poisoned. And so in my painting, I include images from the Pompeii frescoes, to show that there was, at this particular time, paganism and Christianity would have sort of been mushed together. It's like paganism hadn't been really pushed out. The most that they passed, or the only pro-Christian edict was put out was the Edict of Milan, and that didn't make Christianity the legal religion. That didn't come till a lot later. All the Edict of Milan did was say, well, we are going to tolerate Christians. That's it. So there wasn't all that much on the books yet. So you still had a lot of paganism going on at the same time of emerging Christianity. So anyway, I did, that's what I was thinking of when I did that piece, kind of a tribute to Arius. And of course, the point I make is that later on, of course, he becomes important again because part of the Reformation, oh yes, we have Lutheranism, we have Christian Reform, but we also have the Unitarians. And guess what? The Unitarians were the first ones to really reject the idea of Jesus' divinity and just go back to a single unifying God. There is that aspect of Christianity that sounds a little pagan. I won't go into too much depth about it, but a God having relations, however immaculate, with a mortal and producing a man God sounds a little Hellenistic. You know what I mean? Sounds a little Greek, doesn't it? So anyway, there were a lot of reasons, but very curious, interesting stuff. Okay, I'm going to move it really quick now. I also did a series of smaller pieces that were sort of tributes to what I call skeptics and atheists who are American, just because I think that they need a little credit. When we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton here, it's said that, she was a feminist, but it was sort of the unholy coupling of she was a feminist atheist, which is like double deadly. And of course her best friend was, who's on the?
Susan B.
Susan B. Anthony. Best friend was Susan B. Anthony. And Susan B. Anthony is famous because she was not an atheist. I don't forget, a lot of people don't even know who Elizabeth Stanton is. She's been erased from history. She's been erased from history because of her atheism. And I think what we now call secular phobia, I think it's because of secular phobia that she's been erased from history. She did a lot of research on how sexist the Bible was. I mean, she had groups of people researching this stuff and showing and saying, our problem is the Bible for women, as she said. Our problem is the Bible because it's baked into Scripture. I'm just saying what she said. So I wanted to do a series of kind of funerary wreaths for these individuals, since I think that they, again, have sort of endured something kind of special kind of prejudice, really. That doesn't, of course, have anything to do with ethnicity or race or anything. And so I did kind of try to do a takeoff on a trompe l'oeil kind of look, and of course there's only black and white photos of her, so, I really, and one of the reasons I stopped doing these is because I was so dependent on old photographs, which weren't very good, and I was just like, man, it's really hard to do portraits from that. But in her case, I tried to make it look like a sort of piece of paper nailed to wood and all of that. Did a little research on flowers, on what flowers and wreaths symbolized, and all of that. My second one is of Langston Hughes. Now, that's why I had to add skeptics and atheists, because he wasn't a pure atheist. In fact, I think he was maybe very briefly an atheist. I think during his early years, during the Harlem Renaissance, I think he might have questioned, but he changed his mind at various times. But I think what's really significant about is what he went through because of a single poem, which is called Goodbye Christ. And this poem was unpublished. Goodbye Christ was not even published. And he was on a train with one of his friends, and he was doing a tour of Russia. He wanted to check out the Marxist state, see what that was all about. And he wrote this poem, I think, on the train, and it was given to one of his friends, Marxist friends, and that was what he thought was the end of it. Well, it turns out this unpublished poem gets published. And of course, it's basically saying that we don't need Jesus anymore because we've got socialism. So anyway, it was, I don't know if he ever considered it like one of his best works or anything, but it came back to haunt him. So later on in life, he shows up at various venues to do lectures, and evangelists are all there with their bullhorns and and all of that. So he ended up paying a price for it. It even was mentioned during the McCarthy hearings. Of course, he was asked whether he was a communist, which then he had to say no. I think he had sympathies in that area. And of course, it was also he was asked if he was an atheist, because atheism was very much associated with communism. So he even had to answer for this. When you think about the censorship and the repression that really represents, that you couldn't even write a poem about this without being harassed during your life. So I wanted to try to be inclusive with this series, because sometimes in these paintings I feel like, oh gosh, am I just painting the history of white people here? So I think, okay, I got to try a little harder to research and diversify who I'm representing. So I wanted to have women, and actually this series was supposed to have one more person, and that was Carl Sagan. And I got cut short for time. I was trying to get these pieces ready for a show, and I just never got to that final portrait. Carl Sagan would have been great, because I think he was one of the early examples of a scientist, atheist, that really influenced me positively, where he really said, religion has held science back, and we've got to realize that. It might be not so much the case anymore. I think we have examples of people that are believers who are also good scientists now. I don't know if it's quite, but I think at one time we have to look at Galileo and the church's position on the heliocentric model. They rejected. So we have to think about that stuff. My final person that I wanted to memorialize was Madeleine Murray O'Hare. She was called the most hated woman in America. And again, that deadly combination of being a feminist atheist. Now, she challenged the courts because her son was being taught prayer in public school. And she went all the way to the Supreme Court, she won. But of course, she was hated after that. It had a terribly violent, terrible death, kidnapped, mutilated, not related to religion. It was just a botched kidnapping thing. But after she was found dead, it was like people rejoiced. They were happy about it. Which I think is really horrible. But we know some of the statistics about how people in America feel about the godless, and of course, a very unpopular group in America. But anyway, I felt that her efforts to really spread her views, which is that, okay, as an atheist, I'm just a person that would say, instead of building a church, let's build a hospital. Let's, instead of, doing things for constantly preparing for another world, why don't we make this world the focus and improve this world? So these were the kinds of things she had to say. I thought she deserved something. So I did a memorial for her as well. So anyway, I think I'm probably hitting my limit here of what you can stand. And I'm certainly, I have to open myself up for questions here. So if you, if you have any questions for me, I'd be glad to answer them. Yes?
I noticed, it's hard not to notice all the patterning
Yes.
and the color in contrast to the darkness of the
Yeah.
stories and the images. So how do you approach
I
that?
sometimes have had trouble justifying that, because I think when it comes to the color, it's sort of what I think a painting needs to have. And yet, the problem is, hey, wait, if your intention is to show all this darkness, why aren't these all like gray and black and monochromatic? And the truth is, I just could not conceive of them really not utilizing color. The other thing is that I did take the reference to rose windows in cathedrals and the color that's usually in mandalas and mosaics, and I did want to reference those things, and it sort of gave me, I guess, the excuse I needed to deal with color. I have a real hard time thinking of painting and not color. So my hope is that somehow it sort of works, and maybe if I had, and again, I'm just thinking through here, because I'm always reconsidering what I've done, so I've criticized myself for that. But I'm kind of wondering if maybe it would be just too much to have maybe a dark, grim, kind of back, and maybe the idea of kind of making them colorful, and then a little bit of a contrast in the content sort of kind of rubs each other a little bit in a funny way,
Mhm.
Maybe that's not a very convincing reason, but
Is the patterning appropriated as well, or are you creating that yourself?
I did, some of it is. Now, the whole format itself, I appropriated from floor mosaics, one in particular in Turkey, where they had a series of, I think, gods in this kind of format. And I loved it. I fell in love with it. And I blatantly stole it, the format. And you know what they say, good artists borrow, great artists steal. I guess that's thinking I'm a great artist. That's kind of egotistical. That's a little egotistical. But I borrowed it, and I wanted to have a reference to antiquity, or some other time, that I thought that was going to be interesting to do that for a history painting, But some of it's also just my own invention too, I think especially some of these forms here, I don't think I took that from anything. I just, I get my compass out and I just go crazy, I just start, doing all kinds of stuff, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But in these pieces, I sort of really enjoyed having my large-scale compass to just kind of play with circular forms and all of that. Any other questions, or? Yeah.
What does the back of these look like? Are they?
I can, if you're, we have to pack this show up after this, so if you want to hang out a little bit, I'll show you. What we did, again, and I should mention that I have my fantastic carpenter, why don't you raise your hand, Mike, so you can get a little credit. I designed these, but I do not build them. I actually am his assistant when we build. But he was the one that figured out that we would take bendable plywood and do several layers of bendable plywood. And then, and of course, we built them around a styrofoam circle. So out of a thick piece of circular form, we built the bendable plywood, then popped the styrofoam interior out, and then put bracing in the back. Yeah, they're quite a hassle to build, I will say, and rather expensive to put together. But I really wanted to have the real thing. I wanted to have. I feel like you really need to have the determination to build what you feel your work should be. So anyway, Mike is, again, the person that helps me build my projects, and
He's never been accused of underbuilding.
he's been accused of underbilling. I don't think he has. I think our first one, I think we overbuilt, and it's really heavy. And I think, and that one is not here. That's, somebody bought that.
We trimmed down the weight over.
Yeah, we got, the more we did them, the more we were able to make them, or I should say, Mike was able to figure out ways to make them lighter. But yeah, the first one was like, really heavy.
These are surprisingly light too. 'Cause,
Yeah.
You know, Brian and I have hung them and helped bring them in and everything, and, because of the fact that you use birch and all
Yeah.
that, they are way, way lighter than what you would think, especially if you've ever painted in, masonite or MDF. If you've ever painted on either one of those, you took those at the same size, it was just, weigh a ton, and so these are nowhere near as heavy as you would
The
think.
first one we built, we used masonite just because I just didn't have money for birch ply. It weighs a ton. But these, yeah, they're on birch ply. And I think Mike also found ways to use less and less support and still get the same effect. So anyway, if you're hanging around a little later, I can show you the back of them, But, so they were quite an ordeal to construct, for sure. Other questions?
What is alkyd?
Alkyd is a kind of oil paint. Actually, it's called Griffin, and they were designed, these alkyd colors were designed for illustrators, because illustrators would often need to have camera-ready work overnight, and I love the drying time. You can virtually get overnight drying, and yet a good 4 hours or more of working time like oil. They behave exactly like oils. The only difference is instead of linseed oil, they have like,
Alkyd resin.
what is it? Soy oil, soybean oil.
With an alkyd resin.
And yeah, alkyd resin. So they really behave just like oil paint, but they dry quicker. Now, if I use impasto, obviously that's not going to be dry the next day, but it'll dry a lot quicker than any oil paint, where you could be waiting for months for impasto.
Impasto is thickly applied oil paint, thickly applied paint.
Right, yeah. So, if any thick paint, with normal oil paint, like I said, you might as well just set it aside for a couple months, because but with alkyd, it could be dry in a week or so, week and a half maybe. So I do like it. These are all Gamblin products, alkyd, Griffin oil paint. I use all the Gamblin, Neil McGill, all of those they work for me. I feel like I'm a very traditional person, but I'm not crazy. If something dries faster, I'm going to use it. If something expedites my process, I'm going to use it. Some other did you have a question?
How much time do you spend sketching and studying what you want to do?
A lot of prep
for each
time.
one?
A lot of prep time. I have to research first and get ideas and kind of get a handle on the historical event. So there's always that part, which I do enjoy. And then of course, yes, there is a lot of sketching. I have sketchbooks full of different formats, and then a lot of prep. They're pretty labor intensive. I think there's a part of me that enjoys it. It is sometimes, it can be kind of like torture because, you're just waiting and waiting to get the thing done. And these usually take about 4 or 5 months to do. But somehow the process agrees with me. I'm just not a spontaneous person, Yeah.
So for the one behind you that has a lot of purple and yellow, strong contrast,
Yeah.
are the images also supposed to contrast what's in the middle as well?
You mean these images?
Yeah, compared to the outer ones that are normally.
Yeah, I try to use a variety of things. I think the violet and yellow, obvious complements. And then I had also kind of this, even though it's sort of a teal, it's kind of blue. And then I try to do, a lot of times I'll use double complements, blue, orange, yellow, violet. And then there are some areas that will be sort of low contrast, and other areas that will be a little bit more high contrast. I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, I was asking if it had anything to do with the contrast between kind of like the inner circle, which is a bit more like violent or aggressive, but the
Yeah.
outer circle is a bit more cheerful with the skeleton dancing and people.
Yeah, yeah, I think there's some irony there, you know, a little kind of like tongue in cheek, you know. I'm not sure why I think a lot of times it has more to do with, for instance, if I made a lot of these more contrasty, it can be too much. I mean, so sometimes I have to make certain areas more neutral, you know, and then other areas I can have them coloristically pop. But it can be a problem where it's just too much, you know, too much color contrast. So a lot of times I'm trying to neutralize some things and let other areas pop, and, you know, that's kind of, you know. Did you have a question, or? Okay. Anything else? Any other questions at this point? Well, thank you. I appreciate you showing up, and I hope you got something from this.